Hi, Steve. Thanks for joining me today.
It's nice to be with you, Lou.
Great. It's great to have you. You're here to tell us all about your latest novel. What is it called? And it's got quite an amazing name. It's a unique name. So tell the viewers what it's called and what is it about?
It's called Epitaph for Sorrows, and it's a story of Argentina, not the story of Argentina, but a story. And it's set in the period from immediately prior to the overthrow of Perón in 1955 through 2007. And it's a story of Argentina in a terrible, terrible period because there's an overthrow. There are several military governments. There are attempted returns to civilian rule. Perón, after being overthrown and exiled for 18 years, comes back to the country and he's made president again. He promptly dies. And so there are civil and military conflicts that cause great bloodshed and chaos in the country. It's secondly a story, and this was the motive for it, of a young girl by the name of Nelly Rivas. And she became the companion and intimate of Perón when she was 13 years old. And she moved in with him when she was 14 and lived in the presidential palace. And by the time she was 15, he had been overthrown. And she was sent to jail for child prostitutes. And she and her family were persecuted for years afterwards.
Wow.
And the third element of the story, and perhaps the most important one, is about an orphan named Dolores, who becomes convinced that she is the child of Perón and Nelly Rivas. And she sets about searching for herself by trying to find her mother. And then finally, the great theme of it is our eternal search for an elusive truth that can give our lives meaning.
Wow, it sounds like a really deep story. What made you write it?
It was really Nelly. I was a teacher and I taught contemporary Argentine politics for some time in university. And I became familiar with the story of Nelly Rivas and other young girls who cavorted with Perón after the death of his wife Evita, and then it became known that she was his intimate, and so I was taken with this story and tried to imagine what it was like and what it said about him and what it said about Argentina and what it said about the possibilities of a young girl's life. And that was really the motivation.
Is this real? Did Perón, really get intimate, get involved with a 14-year-old child?
Yes, the story of Nelly and Perón is factual. It's based in recognized history. There is a public record of her affair with him, if you will. And so I've adhered to that record. And there are, of course, many things that are unknowable, including the degree of their intimacy. But it was widely assumed, and it was prosecuted in court as if they were lovers.
The principal characters in your story, tell us about them and who are they?
Of course, Nelly and Perón are two of the principals. Perón less than Nelly because he steps off stage and Nelly is left to her own devices. And then Dolores, the orphan, who is put on the doorstep of a convent orphanage in Buenos Aires about the time that would have coincided with a full-term pregnancy if Nelly had been pregnant. And it's a mysterious person who puts her on the threshold of the orphanage, and then she's left there and stays there until she comes of age and leaves to pursue a life of work. The other character is Andrés Carriego, who is a fictional journalist, but very much in the style of Argentine independent journalism. It's very literate. It relied on occasional papers and broadsheets and independent literary magazines. And Carriego is someone whose life traces the path of journalism in Argentina, which was interdicted and shut down during the time of the military governments.
Your main characters, I know Dolores is really very precious to you. She is the invisible orphan in this motherless world, as you said, of political power. What do you mean by that, and what story are you trying to tell via Dolores?
Each of us has a story, and I think that our stories are passed down through our cultures and also through our families. And so Dolores has no family, and the culture that she receives is from the nuns and from storytellers and from the library and from friends. And so she patches together what she hopes will be a record of her life with reference to the history and comings and goings of Argentina in her time. And sadly, Dolores is quite off. From her earliest age, she has uncontrolled dreams and fantasies and even ecstatic visions in the Roman Catholic tradition. So she's taken with the young virginal saints and so forth. And she interprets the world through her dreams and also through her effort to record her life, and sometimes has a hard time telling which is which.
What message are you trying to portray via Dolores? What is her meaning in the story, and how does she represent our society at present?
People will take away different things from this tale, and that's what I prefer. So I'm not trying to tell a single story. I would like for people to try to understand Dolores, but her dilemma is one that is common to us all, but in a very extreme version. That is, we're all invisible. The people who move and shake and change the world really don't know very much about us, and they don't much care either, as far as I can tell. In her case, she's invisible in a bolder way. That is, she has no agency. She doesn't have a story. She doesn't have a family. She has no power. And she's a girl. She's a young girl in a society that doesn't have any particular regard for young girls, except as objects.
Steve, that's well said. You're right. She's a girl, so has she been pushed aside? Does she represent the unrepresented people?
In many ways. And Argentina has become famous, and rightly so, for the efforts of the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo and the grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo, who protested throughout the military period to get access to their children and grandchildren who had disappeared or been disappeared by the military and by death squads in this time of terrible conflict. And so once one gets past that, there still are scores of invisible people who are dispossessed and ignored. And the children that Nelly Rivas was locked up with were child prostitutes. No one cared for them. They were on the streets, and so they were taken off the streets and put in prison, but no one cared for their future or their development. No one cares for Dolores. And we walk along through our own world, invisible as we are, and we walk right by people like Dolores.
Well said, Steve. You're right. You're right. That does happen. And I really sincerely hope that people can sense and get the essence of that by reading Epitaph for Sorrows. Now, Steve, Dolores, would you say she is a strong person? Does she empower women? Does she represent women power? Is she strong? Is she happy? Does the story have a happy ending?
She's not strong, but she becomes strong. And in that regard, it's an uplifting life for her. Against all odds, she actually writes a book-length journal and delivers it in pieces, even though she's living on the streets much of the time. She delivers a manuscript to this journalist, to Andres Carriego, and who pieces it together and makes a book out of it that he surrenders to the public and calls it Epitaph for Sorrows. And toward the end of her life, after her quest to find her mother and to find meaning and truth and herself, she really still has an optimistic view of things. for what reason no one could possibly understand.
Well, optimism is really important, and it gets her through whatever she's got through. But I need to ask you, Steve, their child, Perón and Nelly Rivas, did they actually have a child? Because I know the affair is based on fact. Is the child totally fictional, or could a child have happened? Could they have had a child?
Well, a child could have happened, as you say. It would have required that the two of them were sexually intimate and that Nelly became pregnant and so forth. It's not impossible for that to have happened, but there is no record at all of that having happened. So Dolores is a bit Anastasia-like. And the last of the Romanovs, for decades and decades, people believed in the story of the lost Anastasia. And Dolores is like an unsung version of that because she doesn't come from the aristocracy or from royalty. She comes from the most common background. But she, in her dreams and in her conversations, real or imagined, believes herself to be Nelly's daughter, and therefore Perón is her father, whom she hates.
Now I've got to ask you, Nelly Rivas. Nelly Rivas and Perón. I have to ask you again, I know you've already answered it. That actually happened back then. A man who is so high up in the ranks of political power got involved with a 14-year-old child?
She was 13 when she first
13,
met him.
Okay, that's even worse. 13-year-old child. Did that happen? How did it happen? And why did everybody turn a blind eye to it, Steve? Because there'd be madness and chaos if anything like that happened in this present day and age.
One would hope. But what happened was Perón had lost his wife, Evita, the famous Eva Perón, to cancer in 1952. And so 18 months later, he's in a terrible depression. And his aides, who want to please him in every way, think that because he's got an eye for the young girls, that they should surround him with young girl students. And there is a student union of secondary school girls that is trotted out to the presidential estate, and they swim in the pool and they ride bicycles and they go to the theater and keep him company. And he's just much happier. And he happens to single out Nelly, and by the record, apparently he singled her out the first time he met her.
And what happened? Did he groom her? Did he wine and dine her, take her out? You mentioned that she was dressed in fine clothes, wore fine jewelry. Did she fall in love with all of that? Did she fall in love with him? How did it develop, Steve? What happened?
She felt that she was a listener who could make his life easier. And so mainly she felt that she listened to his troubles and tried to cheer him up. And it became inefficient from his standpoint to have her being motored back and forth from her apartment with her parents to his estate. And so he invited her to stay there. She stayed and then moved in. She was very uncomfortable in the beginning, but he lured her and he gave her great gifts. He allowed her to encourage her to wear Evita's clothes and put on Evita's jewels. He took her to an international film festival, and there are pictures of the two of them together just living it up.
Wow.
And so how could she not fall for it? Because it was the most important moment of her life.
Did she fall in love with him?
In the course of her life, and she lived until, I think, 2013, something like that. She always was faithful to that memory, and she never said an unkind word about him, despite the fact that he had moved on and had remarried and had come back to the presidency and then died. And she had plenty of reasons to give him up to the authorities because she was under the pain of law. But she never did. She never did. She felt that it was a good a good memory for her.
Wow, so she was quite a woman. She was a loyal woman. And you mentioned earlier that never did she ever see herself as a victim? You mentioned that to me earlier when we had our chat a while ago. Is that true? She never saw herself as a victim.
She never did. She was very firm in that and said that everyone wanted to put her in categories. She was either a terrible girl, a loose girl, a prostitute, or she was a victim, or she was a defendant. But she felt that she was none of those. She thought she was an ordinary girl, a good girl, a girl who would have had an ordinary life, but she had this moment with the most powerful man in the country.
Did he love her, Steve?
Well, I think the thing that one can say about Perón is he really loved himself. And it's unclear. He certainly felt affection for her because when he was overthrown and he fled to a ship that was destined first for Paraguay and then into exile, he sent a driver for her. And he left her 2 little dogs and a box of jewelry and a nice watch and some money. Mm-hmm. And he invited her to come with him on the ship, and she actually was in the car, but she couldn't leave her parents. I mean, she was just a young thing, and she couldn't ask her parents to leave the country with her. And so she just stayed.
So he did invite her. Do you think his intentions were to make an honest woman out of her? Do you think he would have married her and made it all right?
For him to have made an honest woman out of her, he would have had to be an honest man. And I can't guess his motives except to say that I'm sure it would have been more convenient for him and his reputation had she not been available to the authorities and been open to arrest as she was. And for years, her name and his were in the courts.
So he picked this girl out, this child out. He took her, she lived with him. They had however long together. And then he just went and he didn't care what happened to her. So much so that she was thrown into a brothel type place. That's just, there's no words to describe that really, is there? And this is all true. This happened.
That's true. Although the asylum was not a brothel per se, it was a place it was a holding camp for children who had been charged with prostitution. And she was just one more of those. The rest of the kids were children of the streets, homeless or whatever.
With Nelly's character, what point are you trying to make? What do you want people to know after feeling and reading about Nelly Rivas?
I'm trying to explain through her and her family and through Dolores how people can be swept up in affection for ideas and people and movements and ways of living that probably are not worth their attention. But Nelly was a poor girl. Her mother was a portera, a woman who took care of an apartment building, and her father sold sweets in a candy store. And they both believed in Perón because when he became president, he created a Christmas bonus for the working class. And it was the first time they had ever had such a thing. And they were quite taken with his ideology and also this benefit that they got. And yet he was not certainly true to them. The main thing about Nelly and Perón is that their story gives rise to Dolores' story. And Dolores' story is a window on a society and a way of thinking about the history and the culture and the politics, but also just the daily life of people in Argentina during that period of time.
Yeah, totally, Steve, totally. I've got to ask you, your novel sounds like a real eye-opener, and I'm sure it's going to be a bit of a tearjerker as well. Can you tell me, does it have a happy ending? Because it sounds like it's a bit of a dark and depressing story. It's a bit of a sad storyline. Is there a happy ending at the end of it?
There are elements that are positive. I'm not a great believer in happy endings because look at what happens in the course of life. There's so much grief and trouble and good things too. And so Dolores has friendships and loves in life, and she has moments of clarity, and she certainly makes something of herself, of her mind, of her soul, that couldn't have been expected of her given her circumstances. And the fact that she leaves this record and that this journalist honors her by producing this epitaph for sorrows is a triumph for her, even though she's not alive to witness it.
So it shows inner strength, it shows resistance, it shows resilience, strong women. All of that is encompassed in your story. Is that right?
Well, and that is very true of the world of Argentine letters, if I may say. There are such interesting women poets and essayists and fiction writers. The avant-garde of Argentina in the modern period was just stunning, and many of the most brilliant people were women. And they wrote not so much about life outside their circumstances, but the life of the interior. And Dolores is writing about her truth and herself as well as she can. And she fits into that tradition, however modestly.
Is that why you chose to write a novel on Argentine history? Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Why Argentine history?
Well, I was an academic Latin American specialist for many, many years, and I also have traveled many times to Argentina, know people from Argentina, have read a lot of Borges and Argentine poetry and essays and short stories and so forth. And so I had a real affection for it. And it was Nelly, though. It was Nelly because I thought of this girl and I saw her pass by my eyes as I was reading about Argentina at different moments and think of Perón and so forth. And I just thought, there is a girl who has a story. And then after her death, her attorney wrote a really, really interesting book that was called in English, Love and Violence, Amor y Violencia. And he chronicled Nelly's experience in a very fair way. And so I was moved to think again about her story, and then it took off by itself. Dolores came to me, I didn't come to her.
Well, it's brilliant, Steve, because you brought the tale, you brought the facts of an event, of events that went on back in history, back to life again. So I think what you've done, what you've written, what you've created with Epitaph for Sorrows is amazing. It will be amazing. What do you want the readers to take away from your novel? What do you want them to know that they didn't know, but that they wouldn't have known before?
I don't have a particular package that I'm trying to sell in this novel, but I think one of the most elusive themes in life is the separation of fact and fiction. And in Dolores's case, it's highlighted by the fact that she can't tell dreams from reality. And so when someone is telling his or her story, it's not really the truth. It's the story. It's the story they have at the moment. And if they tell it again a few years later, there might be a different emphasis. A new character might move in. And these are all stories. And that is a theme that's worth reflecting on. I think about it all the time. I find it in literature, of course, from Homer on. It's there.
Did you feel connected to Dolores? Did you feel protective? Did you feel like a father figure?
No, I think in this book, there are plenty of women who have the doubtful benefit of being looked after by men. And so what I wanted to do was for Dolores to find her way through the sadness and the joys of life.
And
in this extremely...
Does she?
She does. She does. I mean, she doesn't live a long and prosperous life, but she lives. And she lives in times when her friends are disappearing. And where there are attacks in the city, she's kidnapped and taken by these vigilantes, and then she seeks out and finds her mother, and then is rejected and goes back for more. And so it's a drama in which she's a player, but I felt she stood on her own and didn't need me to take care of her.
Who is your favorite author? Do you have one or a few? Tell us a little bit more.
I think about that a lot, and I like to read the greats. And so Thomas Mann is someone I really admire, and read Faulkner, of course. But today, Magda Szabo, the Hungarian author, who is just stunning, and her work on Hungarian life in World War II is just outrageously good. Olga Tokarczuk, who just won the Nobel Prize a couple of years ago, her work is spectacular, and Ishiguro and so forth. So I read and worry about not reading enough. I write and worry about not writing enough.
What about your academic career? You had a quite heavy, full-on academic professional career. Is that right?
Yes, I was a professor, and I wrote what are called scholarly books, and they were published by scholarly presses, Stanford and Princeton and California. And then I left academia after about 25 years to go to work for a nonprofit organization that had the mission of saving wildlife worldwide.
When did you find out? When did you realize, I want to write a book, I want to be an author? When did you start writing?
Well, I enjoyed the writing process in academia. I enjoyed writing my dissertation and bringing it to publication, and I had, great mentors. And then I wrote a couple more books and felt really that I had said what I had to say, and maybe even a little more. And so when I had a chance to write another long form, I wanted to turn to fiction, and I'd had the notion for both of these in my mind for years and years and years, but didn't have the time to really take them seriously.
Well, Steve, you've got a lot to talk about. I could speak to you for hours, but I know we're on a time limit. So tell us all again, when is Epitaph of Sorrows out, and where can it be got from?
July 2021, and it can be acquired through the Conrad Press and also through Amazon in both paperback and electronic versions.
Well, what can I say? It's been an absolute pleasure having you on here and talking with you, chatting with you. It's been a real joy. Is there anything you would like to say, Steve, before we sign off and say goodbye?
It's been my pleasure entirely, Lou.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.